The Food Safety Modernization Act, also known as FSMA, is transforming our food safety system by shifting the focus from responding to foodborne illness outbreaks to preventing them. Under FSMA, fresh produce is covered by the Produce Safety Rule. Depending on what type of produce a farm grows, where they are selling it to, and how much they are selling, they could be subject to the Produce Safety Rule. Farms that are subject to the Produce Safety Rule can be subject to routine regulatory inspections. In Oregon, FDA conducts farm inspections. ODA's work is funded by FDA, but it is non-regulatory. ODA's work consists of education, outreach, and technical assistance only. ODA's goal is to ensure that producers have the training and resources needed to understand and implement the rule. ODA has partnered with Oregon State University to offer education and outreach through our Produce Safety Alliance grower training classes and technical assistance via on-farm readiness reviews. On-farm readiness reviews, or OFRRs, are voluntary, free educational site visits typically conducted by ODA staff and OSU faculty. They are intended to help farm operators see where and how the Produce Safety Rule may apply to their operation. At the conclusion of each review, the team offers tips on how the farm can best comply with the rule. This series of videos provides a snapshot of what an on-farm readiness review looks like on a small, diversified operation, with an important exception: there is never an audience during an OFRR. The videos were shot at East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District's Headwaters Farm in Gresham, Oregon. Each video can stand alone or may be viewed separately based on your interests. When viewed together, the 5-part series provides a holistic view of the OFRR.
I just want to emphasize that we're really focused on talking about the rule today, but even if you're not covered by the rule, if you're fully exempt or if you're qualified exempt, all of the stuff that we're talking about are good agricultural practices as well. So think about how you can implement this information on your farm, whether you're covered by the rule or not. So when it comes to soil amendments and produce safety, there are really 6 questions that you should be asking yourself. The first is, what type of soil amendments do you use? There's kind of a ranking of risk. So there's general soil amendments, which covers everything. So inorganic soil amendments like gypsum and lime. Synthetic soil amendments are part of this soil amendment spectrum. You get a little bit more risky when you start talking about biological soil amendments. So those encompass everything that come from a biological origin. So whether it's, leaf mulch or straw or post-consumer green waste. There's a lot of things that are part of biological soil amendments, and there are some risks associated with those types of products. So if you look at pre-consumer green waste, so like yard clippings and leaf collection that gets turned into compost. So when those materials are collected, it's hard to ensure that there are no biological soil amendments of animal origin incorporated into them, right? So think about dog feces that might be in somebody's yard when they rake their leaves and gets mixed up in that material. But generally, the risks with that type of material are pretty low. When we start talking about biological soil amendments of animal origin, we're typically focused on manure-based products, but these also include things like fish emulsion, bone meal, blood meal, crab meal, basically anything that comes from an animal is included in these Basales, which is an abbreviation that I'll use. And so the risks associated with Basales now come down to what animals did they come from? So some animals are known carriers of certain human pathogens, like Salmonella and Campylobacter tend to be more associated with poultry manure, whereas E. coli is associated with ruminants. So we have known risks associated with especially manure-based soil amendments. When it comes to the produce safety rule, these types of soil amendments are further classified by treated versus untreated. And so untreated Basales have a much higher risk because there have been no steps taken to kill any of those pathogens. Treated Basales are very specifically defined under the produce safety rule. And there are 2 levels of treatment. Typically, the processes are either a temperature, chemical process, or biological process that has been scientifically validated to reduce human pathogens. You can't test your way out of this, so you can't make a product and then have each batch tested. The actual process that is used to treat the material has to be scientifically validated, and then you follow that process in making that material. There's a high level of standard, and when we talk about application intervals, we'll get back to that. For folks that are making on-farm compost or even commercial compost operations, there are 2 scientifically validated processes that have been written into the rule: static aerobic composting and then turned aerobic composting. And they specifically define the time and temperature and number of turnings associated with each of those processes. So we've talked about what type of soil amendment, so whether it's a synthetic or a biological or a Basale, and then of the Basales, if they're treated or untreated. You also need to ask yourself what crops are receiving these soil amendments, because there are specifications in the rule in terms of applying either an untreated or a treated Basale to different types of crops and how those are applied. So one, is it actually a crop that's covered by the produce safety rule? And if it's not, then this does not really apply under the guise of the produce safety rule. But you still want to think about, especially if you're using untreated manures, how those could impact food safety for all of the food crops that you're growing. But also think about, is it a root crop? Is it a crop that comes into contact with the ground? Or is it a crop that grows up off the ground? Like tree fruit, the risks associated with manure application for a tree fruit crop are going to be very different than the risks associated with a strawberry crop. When do you apply them? So how close to harvest are you applying these different types of soil amendments? Are they going to contact the harvestable portion of the crop either during or after application? How much and how often do you apply these soil amendments? We're really focused on produce safety, but I also encourage you to think about environmental impacts of fertilizer applications as well. And then the last is, how are they stored and transported? Because in the rule there are requirements related to storage and handling, and doing that in a way that, one, minimizes the chance of recontamination. So if you have both untreated Basales and treated Basales, you do not want to recontaminate your treated Basales with an untreated material, because now that treated material is considered untreated. So really thinking about where there are possibilities for cross-contamination with tools, equipment, workers, and then trying to minimize that as much as possible. So minimum application intervals, untreated versus treated, how the Basale is applied, and then the minimum application interval. And so you'll see that the rule does not prohibit applying untreated Basales to your crops. It just needs to be done in a particular way that minimizes risk. So with the untreateds, you'll see there are 2 different application methods. So in a manner that does not contact covered produce during application, and minimizes the potential for contact with covered produce after application. And then the second one does not contact covered produce during or after application. For the first one that we talked about, you'll see that the minimum application interval is reserved. And so the FDA has, when they published the rule, They said that there's not enough scientific research for us to actually say what that minimum application interval should be. If you're applying it in a manner that doesn't contact the covered produce during application or after application, so an example of that, a good example is like with tree fruits, where the covered produce does not come into contact with the ground or where the Basal would be at any time. There's actually a 0-day application interval. For treated Basals, there are the two different levels. So there's the lower level, so the slightly lower testing standards for the treatment process. Those can be applied in a manner that minimizes the potential for contact with covered produce during and after application. So that's a 0-day application interval. And then treated Basals to the highest standard can be applied in any manner with a 0-day application interval. So that includes stuff like root crops, where you are intentionally applying these Basals to the crop, the ground where the crop is growing, where it's likely that the crop is going to come into contact with that Basal. Just quickly on worker training, the rule doesn't specify anything in this section specifically around worker training, but workers should understand the risks associated with handling and applying these materials and be trained to minimize the risks of cross-contamination. So anybody who's working, especially with untreated Basals, should be aware of the tools that they're using, the clothes that they're wearing, footwear, be trained to wash their hands, and prevent cross-contamination between those materials and covered produce, food contact surfaces, basically any point where fresh produce might become contaminated with those materials. Last but not least, there are some record-keeping requirements. So if you're making compost on farm and you want it to be considered a treated Basals, you need to keep records of your time, temperature, turning to verify that you're following one of these scientifically validated processes. If you're buying a treated Basal from a third-party supplier, so whether this is compost or bagged chicken litter or feather meal, you need to have documentation from that supplier that it has been treated to a scientifically validated process and stored and handled in a way to prevent cross-contamination. And so that's typically referred to as a certificate of conformance. If you are using these materials and want to use them as a treated Basal, you want to ask your fertilizer supplier for documentation of, how is the material treated, how has it been stored and handled in a way to prevent cross-contamination.
Interviewing the farmer and walking the farm allows reviewers to get a full picture of on-farm activities and practices. Reviewers follow standardized, open-ended, walking around questions as prompts to ensure that we address produce safety rule-specific issues and give the farmer the opportunity to tell the story of their operation. That way, the technical assistance we provide is targeted to the specific practices of their farm.
So Emily, what type of soil amendments do you use on your farm?
We use packaged soil amendments that we buy. We primarily use feather meal, gypsum, azomite, zinc sulfate, a few little micronutrients.
Okay, so mostly inorganic, and then the only Basal, like a manure-based product, would be the chicken, the feather meal? The
feather meal. We've used a little bit of Mary Neg's Perfect Blend 444.
Okay, do you know what's in that?
I think it has chicken manure in it. It does have some organic things in it.
Yeah. And then do you know how that material is treated? Do you have any documentation from the supplier?
I don't.
No. Yeah, so that would be something to ask the supplier if they can provide documentation about the treatment process and how it's been stored and handled. It looks like, you have this stuff separate from where you're handling fresh produce, which is good. And do you apply these to all of your crops?
Yes.
Yes. And you don't use any other compost, or do you use any like ag teas as a soil amendment?
No, we do. Actually, we use fish emulsion and liquid kelp at transplant time.
Okay, how do you use that? Like, what does that
We do
process look like?
like a vat of it, and we dunk the cell trays.
Okay, so just to the soil or the whole?
I mean, the goal is to get the soil fully wet, but I'm sure the plants get wet too.
Yeah, so that would be considered well, if it's held, so the definitions under the rule get a little complicated. So if it's held for more than an hour, then it becomes an agricultural tea. If it's less than an hour, it's not. But you just want to think about the things that come into consideration when you're looking at ag teas. Are the water that you're using to mix it, and then how that's being applied and when and to what crop. So those questions that we just talked about. And so if the fish emulsion you're using has been treated, and you're using water that has no detectable E. coli, then that's considered a treated soil amendment if it fell into that ag tea category. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Okay.
Looking into the documentation from the fish emulsion supplier, and then the water that you use to mix that material up. So,
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So based on what you've said, the stuff that you're using, it sounds like it's all treated, but you would want to verify with the supplier. And then how do you apply your amendments? And really, I'm just focused on the feather meal
Okay.
and the 444.
It's pretty hand applied. We put it in buckets. We use these yogurt containers, and it's after we've marked out the beds and done whatever tillage we're gonna do. We just put it on the surface, and then we either rake it in or harrow it in before planting.
So right before planting is when you apply those materials. Yeah. Okay. And so what do you think is like the shortest interval between like when you apply on a crop? Like what are some of your shorter crops that you?
Probably like radishes or arugula.
Yeah.
And those would be, in the middle of the summer, it could be 5 weeks.
Right.
Yeah.
So in that case, especially with something that's a root crop that's covered produce, like if you're covered by the rule, you would want to make sure that your soil amendment is treated to that highest standard.
And that's something you would find out from the distributor.
Supplier. Yeah. So it'd probably come from the manufacturer, but your distributor might be able to get you a copy of that. How do you ensure that there's no cross-contamination between like tools and workers that are using soil amendments and doing other activities involving produce?
Well, we have different tools for harvest. Our harvest tools are just they're kept in a different room and washed after each use. And just the way field work works, we generally have like a harvest day or we have a field work day. So it's not usually, I can't think of a time when someone would be spreading manure, or we don't use manure, but spreading fertilizer and then going and harvesting and washing. So
that's great. Do you provide any specific training to your workers?
Yeah, at the beginning of the harvest season, we talk about just basic food safety things. Like I really emphasize hand washing and just thinking about, wearing clean clothes and boots, where your boots have been, and just basic stuff like that.
Yeah. Great. Good. Rowan, can you tell us about your compost operation here?
Yep, so we have staged compost right here, and we get feedstocks from Burns Feed Store, the feed store across the street, and that's a mix mostly of biological materials like leaf litter and hay, but we do get some bedding from their chicks and their rabbits, so there is some manure. We also have vegetable waste mixed in. Most of it's from the wash stations, but some of it would, say, come out of the hoop houses or close places.
Yeah. Okay, and how do you manage your compost piles?
So we have 3 aerated boxes, so we do static aeration.
Okay.
And we use our tractor bucket and we fill them up, and then we wait until we deem them finished.
Okay, do you measure the temperature?
We have a log.
You have a log? Okay. And are you blowing air into those? Or? Cool. What's your temperature and time process look like?
We run it until it stops being heated, till it matches ambient temperature, really.
Okay. Do you maintain it at a certain temperature for a certain number of days?
Yeah, so we try and keep it at 160 for over a week.
Okay. And that is all recorded? Yeah.
So we're tracking the temperature for each box independently because the idea is to have them on a rotational basis. So we're harvesting A and then backfilling it, and then maybe 2 or 3 weeks later we do B and C. I do have one other question. So if we're trying to get 131 for 3 days, like, do we need to be tracking it daily then to demonstrate that we have the consecutive days?
Yes. Static composting that maintains aerobic conditions at a minimum of 131 for 3 consecutive days and is followed by adequate curing. So I would say you would want to document those 3 consecutive days. So once you get up to 131, test it for 2 more days to show that. And then in terms of your record keeping, under the produce safety rule, there are requirements for what needs to be on the record keeping sheet. You move it from one pile, no, it's just in there and then it goes through curing. What kind of equipment do you use to move material from this pile into the bins and then after it's done?
Yeah, we use a front loader, just a tractor.
So is it the same front loader that you use? What do you do in between handling the untreated and finished compost?
Pressure wash.
Okay. Do you have any sort of sanitizing step, or is it just?
Yeah, no, we
clean?
don't. We could.
Okay.
I do have a couple of questions about location and proximity to the fields, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on what would be an appropriate buffer or ways to mitigate any type of contamination from this pile to the food production areas.
Yeah, so just like with the animal feces, there's no like prescribed buffer between compost storage and productions, but you do want to think about where the risks lie. So in terms of contamination, you can think about like runoff, so any leachate from the pile. And so keeping it covered is good because you're minimizing the amount of water that's flowing through that material and then potentially running off into the roads or adjacent fields. Wind can also be another potential source of transfer of material. So again, keeping that covered as much as possible will help minimize that. Yeah, so those are the things you want to think about, is just like where are the potential sources for cross-contamination. So traffic around the pile, so like people having access and any equipment that might be used that would potentially get contaminated with any material that's either been handled or isn't covered. And then being aware of that leachate, and if there ever was an issue, coming up with a solution, a corrective action. So I've seen some people build like berms around their pile to prevent that movement of water. But you know, keeping it covered will really help minimize any chance for wind contamination. So, yeah. Answer is no. So it's a separate, organic certification is separate from a certificate of conformance or documentation from the manufacturer that they've followed the specific scientifically validated process to kill pathogens. And it should include, if you're covered by the rule and you want to document that it's a treated product, that letter should include specific language referencing the rule, basically. And the Produce Safety Alliance just came out with a really great fact sheet and template for certificates of conformance. So information for farmers as well as manufacturers. So like how to talk to your supplier, and if they have no idea what you're talking about, something to give them with more information about what's required in the rule, and then basically a template for a certificate of conformance. You can't test into compliance. So they have to be providing documentation that they're actually following the process of the validated process, and then have the backup record keeping in terms of monitoring time and temperature. So you can't like take a sample and get it tested, because that particular sample might be good, but if you're looking at more, yeah.
On-farm readiness reviews take about 2 hours to complete, but are dictated by the farmer. At the close of the OFRR, reviewers summarize what they've seen. They offer up to 3 focus areas where the farm could be in closer alignment with the produce safety rule, share pertinent resources, and answer any questions the farmer may have. If reviewers have taken notes, these are left behind for the host farm's personal records. This video showed a demonstration OFRR in front of an audience. This is not typical. The farmer may invite anyone they would like. However, the OFRR team only shows up with 2 people. When the review team departs, they leave the farmer a spiral-bound OFRR manual, an ODA summary of the visit, any technical assistance resources that may be appropriate, and business cards from the reviewers. The Oregon Department of Agriculture and Oregon State University team members are available for follow-up technical assistance. If the farm is called for a routine produce safety rule inspection by FDA, the farm may request ODA or OSU to observe. This is helpful for the farm, as we may be able to provide more resources based on FDA discussion items, and it is helpful for ODA to better educate others on how the rule is being enforced.
So my name is Rowan Steele. I work for the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. We are a non-regulatory form of local government that operates in Multnomah County, east of the Willamette River. Essentially what we're doing here is we are creating a space to support the development of new farm businesses. We do that by making farm land, farm equipment, and farm infrastructure available at an affordable rate, and we also do trainings around business and good stewardship farming practices. Food safety is a critical component to any farm business. So the goal of all farmers is to create a product that is healthy and wholesome and is fresh and reaches their customer and they love it, it's delicious. But if farmers are making their customers sick, obviously there's a huge liability there. So food safety is especially critical in an incubator environment. We have 15 different farm businesses currently leasing land from us and growing their own enterprises. And so there's a lot of opportunities for cross-contamination, for miscommunications. And so our space needs to be dynamic and it needs to accommodate a lot of users. And it just makes it that much more important that not only are we setting up facilities and systems that are amenable to food safety, but that our farmers are well versed in the produce safety rule. So we decided to have an on-farm readiness review, not just because we wanted to make sure that our farmers understood the law, but also because we wanted to make sure that our facilities were optimal in terms of meeting food safety standards and for our systems to be working for the farmers. Currently, all of our farmers are exempt from the produce safety rule, but a lot of them have grown their businesses quite a bit over their time here at Headwaters Farm and are closely approaching where they would become a non-exempt operation. So as they grow their business, they know what the law is. They know that they need to be keeping logs. They know that they need to be following certain practices. They need to be in compliance regardless of whether they are exempt or not. So having gone through the Produce Safety Alliance training, it was really good to drive in some of the more important points around excluding wildlife in terms of contaminated food or product in the field, in terms of bin washing, and some of the other kind of basic steps that all farms go through, but knowing what is in compliance and what's not. One of the things that I found most valuable is just the understanding of how important it is to have proper hand washing stations at every restroom and at every wash station. Anywhere that somebody's going to need a hand washing station, it's important to have one on site. For our farmers, what really resonated with them was understanding how they need to keep their resources like bins clean. Being able to go through that process and demystify what actually constitutes a proper cleaning program was super helpful. That includes tools, bins, and any food contact surfaces. So another reason that it was important for us to host a readiness review is a lot of farmers do have fear around bringing regulatory entities out to the farm. And so for us as a public entity, we can use this space as a training grounds, not just for our farmers, but other farmers in the area. So it was really important for us, for our farmers, to understand that Oregon's Farm and Food Safety Team is here to provide services in a non-regulatory manner, that they can feel comfortable reaching out if they have questions about how to provide safe food.